am so delighted to introduce to you, if you don't know her already, Dr. Helen Paik. Dr. Helen Paik is such an important member of our institute. She's done some incredibly interesting research already in her career as a senior lecturer at University of New South Wales, and she'll talk to you about that today. I must say as well, Helen has done an amazing job as a faculty lead for engineering at Sydney for the Institute as well, and already done some incredible work putting together a workshop that will be run in October that we look forward to as well, and cross our fingers everyone gets out of that lockdown soon. So I'm just going to pass it over to you. For everyone, if you can put questions in the Q&A, because at the end of this, we'll look at those questions and I'll ask them to Helen. So thank you, Helen, for presenting. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen. Thank you so much, Monica, for the introduction. And of course, thank you for the invitation for this opportunity to talk through the members through IFCYBER seminar series. The title of the talk is Decentralized Identity Management and Credential Sharing. But mostly I would like to talk about two big topics, I guess. I mean, we won't be able to go through any nitty-gritty details of it, but I do want to talk about identity management as an issue. And after 40, 50 years of, since the birth of internet, we still don't know how to manage identity properly. And I would like to talk about decentralization platform as one approach to solve identity management problem. And also what goes with identity management is always on credential. The issue, one of the main issues with identity management is credential sharing. So we would like to talk about how data minimization principles should apply to credential sharing and selective disclosure as one of the approach to achieve data minimization principles in sharing credentials. If you vaguely interested in identity management and started reading on articles or blog, things like that, you probably would have come across this cartoon on the left. It's quite a famous cartoon by Peter Steiner, which was published in 1993. And as you can see, there are two dogs having a chat on the internet. And the point of the chat is that they're talking to each other, saying on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So this cartoon was, when this was published, it's meant to highlight or celebrate even the anonymity that internet gives you, how it allows you to stay private while you are exchanging messages. But of course, the joke of the story, joke of this cartoon at the moment in circa 2021, is that we now live in this era of internet surveillance, right? It's so much data about us on the internet. Of course, we know what's that this entity interacting with you is a dog. Not just that, you know, what sort of brand of food it might eat, what time it might go for a walk in the morning. We could know so much about that individual. But if we reflect on these two situations, it's not sort of the one or the other where we live in. We still live in somewhere in between these two worlds. From service providers' point of view, of course, they could collect so much information about us, but still there's no trust in knowing who the customer is. And they spend a lot of money building that initial trust. So know your customer process. And also from the customer point of view, it's really difficult still to trust service provider. First, knowing whether this is a legitimate service provider, but once you share your data with the service provider, would this be misused? How much would they know about me? So there's still this trust between user and the service provider is nowhere to be seen. I mean, that's practically where we are. So the cost of not having trust and not being able to build trust when we exchange identity apparently is huge. By 2017, I'm sure this probably hasn't changed that much. Still, after 4 or 5 years, the average business user will have to keep track of 191 passwords, and this managing a username and password has become the most hated consumer experience on the internet. I'm sure we can all relate to that. According to a 2014 study, the cost of identity assurance process from business point of view exceeds 3.3 billion. 80% of the hacking-related breaches are due to compromised user passwords. Over 90% of American consumers believe that they lost control of how their personal information is collected and used by the service provider. And we can't really blame them. I'm sure we can all relate to these statistics as well, given frequent hacking and losing your precious personal information to popular hacking incidents that a lot of big companies suffered. So we really don't have much confidence in this data custodian, the service providers, to look after information on our behalf in a confident and trustworthy manner. So having a solution to identity management, and which the issue that we really don't have clear solution for after decades of moving all these lot of interactions online, being able to do this properly really is a fundamental component of building this digitized world. It'll allow us to build trust, and it'll enable future digital economy that we all imagine that will become. One of the side note to this, of course, a lot of the discussion that we will do today is about a human identity. But the side note to this is that, of course, when we talk about identity in this DNA, the context is identity of all things, not just human. So devices that we interact with, it could be a software endpoint that we have to interact with. So anything or any entity that would have to interact online will need to have this identity solution provided. So we have about 3 different models that are in operation in terms of managing your identity. On the left is probably the most common one that we are familiar with. It's called centralized silo solution, where a user, whenever a user needs to engage with the service, the user will have to create an account with their service and again, manage identity with that service. We say it's centralized because it is centralized to that particular service provider. And we say it's silo because it's now user will have to manage each and every account with different service providers. And these service providers don't necessarily talk to each other. Another slightly improved version of this will be a federated model, or they call single sign-on model. All as a UNSW staff members and students probably all familiar with the single sign-on idea, where there's a central identity provider like UNSW or contracted out to Microsoft, and sub-services within that circle of trust within their organization will share the user credentials. So you don't have to keep entering password for, say, library or for school systems, etc. So this is federated model, slightly improved, we say, because then it reduces number of number of credentials that a single user will have to maintain. But obviously this alone doesn't solve the whole multiple user identity problem, because this wouldn't necessarily interact with another single sign-on system that user might have to interact with. Something else that are coming along these days is called is similar to single sign-on, but using a social network credentials like your Facebook or Google to sign up to a new service. Instead of creating a new identity, you can use your existing social network credential. Again, this one is problematic because Facebook or Google is becoming even more powerful and that they can collect more information about your online activity. So all of these services that we are in today, that are operating today, and I'm sure you can relate to all these three models. You have experience with interacting with all these three models today. We consider them as service-centric because your identity is still controlled and managed by the service provider, which are very different to the model that we are familiar with in physical world. In physical world, what we would do is any credential or your identity information will be stored with you. You will have them in your wallet, for example, your driver's license, student ID, any form of identity information, you will have it in your wallet, and you present them to the service provider as you need them. So in a sense, you would have a bit more control over your information in the form of your wallet. So we call this user-centric or me-centric. So this idea of bringing decentralization into identity management wants to provide users with a similar experience as this me-centric model that we're familiar with in our physical world. By having ID provider as a trustless, decentralized registry, so identity registry, but no one owns that registry. And users of the system could connect through the registry by providing a secure public and private key cryptography, using public and private key cryptography management system. So here, through distributed registry of identity management platform and the key management system, users can directly connect each other. So in that, users can create a relationship, identity relationship, a trust relationship directly with each other. So it allows people to form private connections directly without having to rely on some other big identity providers like Facebook or Google. And it's closer to, as close as we can get to what we are familiar with in physical world, as I was just mentioning, called me-centric model. Because on this decentralization platform, what we are able to do is that a single entity, a user, can interact with any credential issuing entity, could be government or any other services, and relevant credentials will be issued directly to the user's wallet in the form of digital wallet, and holders will have greater control over the identity data that way. So what we are saying is that this decentralized form of identity management through decentralized identity registry will allow us to have this sort of what I call me-centric paradigm of identity management, of credential management. But we still have problem when we have to share those credentials with others. Because it's all about having credentials is one thing, but one of the main issues is having to share those credentials in a secure and private manner. So problems with credential sharing, whether it is digital or paper form credential, is that we are, most of the time, we're forced to disclose more information than it's necessary for the purpose of sharing. A typical example that we use is you will have to bring your driver's license to pick up a parcel at the post office. The post office officer just needs to check your name and address, but the driver's license itself has a lot more information, like your date of birth in it. Or if you need to walk into a nightclub and show that you're over 18, of course, you can still present your driver's license, but for that purpose, you just need to show that you're over 18. But the security guard checking your driver's license can still see your name and address on the driver's license. So that'll be a typical example of oversharing and users not having control over how much information will be shared for that purpose, for that moment. And of course, once you share those information, there's always risk of those data being misused. So again, that trust, not being able to build trust between the sharing parties. And I couldn't help sort of taking a screenshot of this COVID-19 certificate that we all, if you're vaccinated, I'm sure we're sort of interested in getting this. I have an iPhone, so my certificate looks like this. And I didn't know that if you had Android phone, which is on Google platform, your certificate would look like this. So, I mean, using this, I would like to talk about sort of data minimization principles a little bit as well. Because when I first saw this, yeah, it looks great. It's got the tick and some number that is official, but it's got my date of birth as quite prominent field in that certificate. So my first thought was, if someone wants to see my vaccine certificate, why would they be interested in how old I am, right? You just need to know that I've been vaccinated. But then the funny thing is, on this side, if you have an Android phone, you don't have date of birth on it, but it's got your vaccination history, what vaccine you got and what date it was administered. Again, curious, right? Do you need to know this when the whole point of certificate might be that just prove that you've been vaccinated? It seems like a lot more detail than what it needs to be. So the data minimization principle in privacy guidelines or regulations would tell you that when you design something for sharing or collecting information from users, you would have to make sure that it is absolute minimum set of information that you collect and also share. Here, it's not, I mean, still this is our latest example of certificate that government issues, but I would say probably the data minimization principle hasn't been thought through, right? Like, do we really need to have date of birth here? If it is there, I mean, could we give user a bit of control over whether this should be shared or not, right? Or do we really need this much detail in the certificate? And as a user who would present this certificate, we don't really have choice as to how much information will be shown to the other party. So to that issue, the digital credential sharing issue, what we did with Rama, one of our PhD students, is to bring this idea of selective disclosure for the digital credential sharing scheme. When you have to share a credential with someone, we would like to bring this idea of selectively sharing the information. So overall, the system works over this decentralized identity platform idea. So it works over blockchain. It'll create credentials that are verifiable. And it works over decentralized identity scheme. But that's sort of less important in the scheme of, less important. What's probably more important for this particular idea is selective disclosure. So what we mean by that is when a certificate or some sort of credential is issued by the issuer, the holder of that credential can choose which fields to be, which attribute of the credential to be shared and which attribute will be redacted, so not disclosed. And that which field should be disclosed and not, the holder can decide depending on the purpose of the sharing. So as you can see here, to one verifier, different fields will be redacted. To another verifier, different fields could be redacted. So we implemented this selective disclosure using a scheme called redactable signature generation approach. So using this redactable signature, what happens is that the credentials are modeled as a set of two trees, and basically at the bottom of the tree, all the credential attributes, so your date of birth, your name, addresses, at the bottom of the tree, but this tree will wrap that information up using a hashing technique, and with signature, the whole tree will be signed at the root. So the whole content representing the credential that can be sent over to the verifier. Idea of redactable signature comes when this attribute, so the actual data in the credential, let's say the user doesn't want to share this particular attribute, then when this signing or hashing process happens, only the hashing value will be included in the signature, not the actual attribute. So when the verifier will look at the signature and wants to unpack and look at the credential, because the verifier will still have the hash value, the whole signature will be valid, but the verifier won't be able to see the actual attribute. So the idea of redactable signature is quite straightforward. What we did in this work is using this idea, we sort of thought of applying this in a flexible way. So giving a full control to the recipient, the holder of the credential, in choosing which attribute to be redacted. We call it flexibility for the recipient idea. So under this scheme, any fields in the credential can be redacted. So any fields can be hidden in the tree attribute. Sometimes issuer may want to put a limit on what sort of attribute can be hidden. So in that case, when the credentials are issued, issuer can put some sort of redactable schema with the credential, so that only those attributes that the issuer is allowing to hide can be hidden by the holder, by the recipient. So this was one of the idea for the paper, for the work. And another idea was to present the whole selective disclosure idea and decentralized identity management idea as an architecture and a system. And one of the new ideas in there is to provide this credential and selective disclosure idea as a service that can be provided to as an API, basically, to anybody who wants to utilize this platform and get benefit from selective disclosure. So we proposed the whole architecture based on blockchain. Blockchain is a decentralized registry management platform, and a whole lot of software services that would allow users to, and the service providers to manage the credential. And selective disclosure being one of the main services idea. The following few slides just talk about the workflow of the system, so how people will use the system. I guess the main point is really here. Oh no, I think it might be the next one, the verification process. So this will happen once the credential has been issued by the provider, which is not shown here. So the the recipient, the holder, would contact the issuer, get the credential issued. Some of the details will be held in the platform. And when the user wants to share that credential with the verifier, but wants to hide a few fields, a few attributes, like the date of birth, for example, that user can ask the platform, call the service, invoking the redaction part, and the service will then return the credential with the parts that to be hidden redacted, and that could be sent to the verifier. Verifier can still contact the platform using all the hash values and the keys provided in the credential, can still verify the credential as a whole, but not being able to see the hidden fields. So that's the main interaction and the usage scenario of the system. There are some similar systems that work on decentralized identity management, but at the time of comparison, what we proposed was providing the selective disclosure and some time constraint access to the credential during sharing as well. And also, I guess we are, as someone who's doing research, we are proposing the whole architecture and the design of the system as one of the contributions, how a system like this might be built and used. So we did implement the prototype on a blockchain and some wallet and some distributed cloud database to store credentials, and did performance test. There isn't much to talk about in terms of the performance, except the main point was that our performance results show that it's sort of typical of any blockchain applications, the transaction throughput and things like that. So this overhead of generating the redaction tree and transferring that data back and forth doesn't seem to create a lot of overhead doing that compared to sort of normal blockchain applications. So it's quite comparable performance to other blockchain applications. So to conclude, we would like to highlight the idea of bringing decentralization to identity management to create more user-centric experience in managing identity. And having trust really will be the basis for building future digital economy, trust in identity management, what I meant. So just as an identity management issue in general, I think it's going to be even more important issue ongoing. And what we proposed through CredChain is, given identity management, sharing those credentials in a sort of private and secure manner is still important. And we want to highlight the issue of data minimization and selective disclosure as one of the approaches to achieving data minimization. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, Helen, for such a wonderful, interesting, relevant talk.